Okay, now we want to talk a little bit more of what this issue of stasis theory, what this really means and how it's used and why it's so important here. See if we can try to cover more than 3 slides here in this next video. Alright, we're talking about theory versus practical layers and kinds of questions. And you talked about theories over the years many times in many classes, many ways, history and science especially. When you're dealing with the realm of the theoretical, you're really trying to figure out where do things come from? Well, how did this issue get here? Where did it begin? How did what are the factors involved that have made it what it is today? It really comes from the Greek, theoren, to sit in the highest row of the arena, to be able to visualize from afar, to get the widest, biggest view of everything. When you're creating a theory, you're trying to see as much as you can about an issue's history, its importance, and who it affects, and things like that. When you're talking about practical questions, you're being much more specific and much more involved with actual people and what kinds of people, what areas of life does this issue really affect, and what should people do about this issue possibly. So when you are creating a theory, maybe you're involved in the practical aspect of it, but you're really beginning probably with the issue itself and what are its aspects and things like that. So there's a big difference really in the sort of the range or the spectrum really of from theory to practical and back and forth. And you'll be dealing with both aspects of this as you go through, right? When you're creating a hypothesis in science class, you're dealing with a specific question. You've taken that theory and created it, leaned it more in the practical realm of how does it really address a specific avenue, a specific situation with real people, real events, real effects that you're trying to measure, certainly when you're creating hypotheses in science class, for example. So a thesis in English class or history class and philosophy, things like that, it's a little bit more general. Hypo is a more specific, and just a plain thesis, if you will, for this class and for others is more general, more theoretical probably than practical. But again, when we're saying practical, we don't necessarily mean important. Theory is just as important as practicality, right? It's good to have your moral, ethical ground of why and what things are before you deal with specific issues, and how to put those in practice. If you don't have your theory right, your practical application of it is going to be probably flawed and not as helpful and meaningful as you want it to be. So practical is not necessarily more valuable than theoretical. So don't think that your thesis has to necessarily be something that has visual, tangible, practical results and issues right away. If your thesis is more intellectual, more philosophical, more theoretical, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay? So it's about what is important to you and what do you want other people to care about. So your thesis can be a definite or indefinite issue. All right? And so you can see there from the little mini flow chart at the bottom, how the ideas have progressed from, in science and not necessarily science, but others, thesis to hypothesis to theory, and it has been studied and proven, and it becomes really a fact. And so, we don't necessarily, like I said, we're not favoring one over the other, but it's important to know really that spectrum, okay? So when we're asking for a thesis statement, in one sense, by the time you get to your final draft, we're be more asking for a hypothesis statement, but don't worry about the technical aspects right here. So when we're talking about generality from theory to practice, it's important to know what does that relate and how does that factor into the kinds of work and the things that you want to say, right? Because the more broad, the wider the generality, that is going to affect the kinds of arguments you're going to create, right? Is ecology better than economy? That's a very broad, general topic. The way we view the world, the plants around us, the ecosystems, is keeping a healthy environment more important than making money and having, cars that can get us to places faster to, that sort of thing. Is ecology better than economy? Very broad issues that have a lot of aspects to them, but it's still an interesting idea that needs to be discussed. But for more specific areas, you move that to more practical, to less general. Should our town reject this grocery store if we have to cut down 5 acres of trees? That's a much more practical aspect of that, much less general, more specific way to phrase almost that same sort of argument, right? Even more specifically for you personally, when you're dealing with just one individual, should I take the time to recycle? It might take me more effort. If I have to separate, like if you lived in a town that separates, aluminum and plastic and paper, things like that, if it takes more effort than just tossing it all into one recycling bag, what is your value system? Is that important to you? If is economy, your time, your energy, is that more important to you than doing your part to save the planet? Things like that. So generality to specificity, it's an important aspect to think about when you're trying to frame what your thesis is, right? And so, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, the level of generality is important because it will determine, one, the amount of research you want to do, which is, I'm sure, a key aspect of what you're thinking about for this task here in the months ahead. How much research do I really need to do? How much time do I need to put into this? That's going to be a question that you're going to almost determine for yourself, assuming you all want to do well, and really, I'm hoping that you certainly want to do well, but the amount of work that you need to put into is going to be determined by the thesis that you yourself create for yourself. And then the amount of research, and then the kinds of proofs that you need to persuade your audience, as we said, in what rhetoric is, finding the available means of persuasion. The level of how general or how specific your thesis is going to be determined by that. So let's play a super fun game, up or down or up as it sees, as you can see there from the slideshow. As the level of complexity increases, as you get more specific, from general to more specific, what do you think that does for the amount of research you have to do? Does your level of research go up? Does it go down? What do you think? Oh, it goes down. The more complex your issue, the more specific your issue, the less research you have to do. Right? As the level of complexity decreases, as you get more general, how much research do you think you have to do? There you go. The more general your issue, the less complex it is, the more research you have to do. Back in our previous example, is ecology more important than economy? That's a very low, complex issue, very general issue, but it's so broad, you have so many aspects of it to research. If you're talking about just yourself, and is it worth my time and effort, the complexity or the specificity of that is much smaller. It's higher in the sense of it's a very specific issue, but you have much less research to do than, say, the philosophies of our entire town and our entire economy system versus, a very specific issue of you, yourself, and your time and your effort, and you have much less research that you need to do. So the level of generality is going to really affect the amount of research you have to do. The more general your thesis is, the more research you're going to do. The more specific your thesis is, the less research you're going to have to do. So something to think about as you start to frame what your thesis is, the general topic, and then the specific thesis itself that you're going to investigate. All right. So how do you determine that? Not just in the realm of, well, I don't want to do a whole lot of work, so I'll do something super specific, but really what the level of generality is, if it's very broad to very specific, is determined by your audience. What does your audience know? What do they need to know? What is the setting of this particular thing? So these ideas are in part certainly for your final thesis itself in April and May, but also any kind of writing, persuasive thing that you're going to be doing. Remember, the point of this class is not just to get you ready for one paper, but to help you practice these skills that you will use again and again in your whole life. So this is definitely one of those more practical issues that you should think about for your entire life. When I'm trying to prove something, I need to know what the audience already believes. I need to know how general, how specific I need to address this issue. What is the environment, and what do I have 5 minutes to talk? Do I have a 2-page paper? Do I have 50 pages and an hour and a half to talk about? That's going to affect your level of generality, how general or specific it is that you're going to talk about, right? What are the audience's feelings about it? What do they know about it already? and really what your main point is, what you really want to say. What is the most important thing that you want to say? And how broad is that? Should that be? How specific should it be? Okay. When you are asking specific questions, it's important to remember that you're also presupposing general ones, right? If I ask, should Sue Ann get married? Say she's, 19-year-old, fresh out of high school, freshman in college. She wants to get married. Well, should she? That presupposes a more general question. Should young people in general get married? Is that right for people regardless of her specifically? Maybe she comes from a wealthy family and she could afford it and all that sort of thing. But more philosophically, more broadly, should young people, age 19-year-old, should they get married at all? Which supposes an even broader question. Really, in this day and age, should people get married? And you need to understand that you can't just jump right to specific questions. They're going to be dependent upon your philosophical platform on even broader questions than that. So it's important to go through, levels of specificity from general, theoretical to practical and specific things. Very important as you start to figure out what are these kinds of questions that I'm asking, which is the essence of stasis theory. These are the kinds of questions you're asking to figure out what it is that I'm really trying to prove and what this issue is here in my thesis.